Bonsoir.
Good evening, one and all, ladies and gentlemen, even those of you following us remotely, and congratulations to the student present for not being on the school holidays and being with us this week. I am absolutely delighted to welcome Artur Kacprzyk amongst us to discuss this issue of nuclear and alliances in the new strategic context. I think that given the analyses that he's conducted, he will focus his talk on the European issue and the NATO issue. He has written extensively on these matters and the prospects for European nuclear deterrence, also on the issue of the deployment of American mid-range missiles in Germany, as well as Russian deterrence, and how Russian nuclear gesticulations happened in a big way in the Ukraine war, and also how Russia's changed its doctrine for this conflict. Also, all the future political prospects for changes in the American nuclear umbrella, and also probably echoing the latest declarations, probably from the future German Chancellor Merz, about having deeper thinking about the extension of British and French deterrence to the European dimension. Is that going to happen or not? Is that just a proposal? Has that already received a positive welcome for some, or is it really a dialogue of the deaf, so to speak? So we are very happy, very honored to welcome a young researcher. Artur Kacprzyk is an analyst at the Polish Institute for International Affairs. After studying at Warsaw University, as I said, he very often was involved in analysis and research papers on this matter. We are happy both because we're seeing a new generation, but also Elise Fayet at IFRI is also taking over these topics. They were extensively dealt with by my generation, those who had followed the evolutions of the deterrence policy after the Cold War. So it's nice to see a new generation taking a new look at issues of deterrence and nuclear policy. And for us, it's also interesting to see a country which is not a nuclear country, which has joined the Atlantic Alliance after the fall of the Berlin Wall, which has now become a major military country in the concert of European nations. It's nice to have his own personal viewpoint, and also maybe to a certain extent to know how his views could lead us to have a more acute view of our own policy, or to refocus our thinking and the way people look at the issue in a different light than in Paris. It's true that here we tend to have a certain view of things. So I'm now going to give him the floor. He knows the rules of the exercise. I told him that he can take as long as he wants to speak, about 45 minutes to an hour, and then maybe I'll have a discussion with him. And also a number of you can ask questions, always giving priority to students. It's even more remarkable because you're officially on holidays at the Sorbonne. So, Artur, I'll give you the floor, and I'm delighted that you're here with us and to listen to you.
Thank you so much to all of the professor and all of you for such a warm welcome, and thank you for having me here. It is my utmost pleasure to be here and speak about a very timely topic. I'm also very happy to see such a great interest in this topic here. I would say that these days, these times, it's increasingly important for both Poland and France to have a dialogue on deterrence issue, security issues. I think both of our countries play special roles in European security. France, obviously, the top military power in free Europe, the only nuclear armed power in the European Union, one of the two nuclear powers in NATO Europe. At the same time, my country, Poland, lies in a critical, central, but also difficult place on NATO's eastern flank. And since recently has the third biggest army in NATO after the United States and Turkey. As Professor already kindly said, I speak only for myself. I, from time to time, have the opportunity to offer my advice to the government, although I am not in the government. And actually, the topic of our today's meeting has become so timely recently with respect to Europe and transatlantic relations that I will take the liberty of focusing my remarks precisely on the future of nuclear deterrence on our continent and in the Atlantic Alliance, in which the US has been for many decades the main provider of nuclear deterrence, with France and Britain and their smaller nuclear forces also contributing to collective allied security. So I want this lecture and discussion to focus on analysis of the current and future nuclear threats and present some recommendations, which I hope we will discuss later. But before going into all that, I think a brief look into NATO's nuclear history is warranted. I don't want this to be an exhaustive history of all that happened in NATO, but I think this history reflects how complicated the extension of nuclear deterrence to one's allies is, especially if you are talking about deterring another nuclear armed state from attacking another country, and how difficult, by the way, is to reassure your allies that you are actually willing to do that you are actually willing to risk nuclear war to defend another country. Because after all, that's what extended deterrence is all about. Now, NATO already had to grapple with these problems in the mid-50s, when it was getting clear that the Soviet Union will sooner or later acquire the second strike capability against the United States, meaning that it was clear that in time, Soviet nuclear forces will be so big that the United States will not be able to destroy them in second strike and will be then a victim of Russian, Soviet then counterstrike. And this was important because at the time, the US and NATO strategy was one of massive retaliation. It basically assumed that if the Soviets attacked Western Europe with their numerically superior armies, NATO would first fire shorter range nuclear weapons at those armies to basically stop them, preferably at the inner German border. But at the same time, that NATO, United States especially, would strike deep into Russia to punish the Soviet Union and to destroy the war-making capability of the Soviet Union. And this was especially important, by the way, for Europeans, because it was feared during the Cold War that the Soviets could actually risk a conflict limited to Central and Western Europe, a conventional one or nuclear one, as long as the Soviet territory was not targeted. But the emergence of Soviet second strike capability meant that by using nuclear weapons to defend its allies, the US would be risking suicide, which famously led General de Gaulle to ask whether the US would trade New York for Paris or whether it would trade Boston for Bonn. And the answer is that no leader would willingly make such a trade. But at the same time, it was also obvious that United States' interest was for the Soviets not to invade and not to dominate Europe. Nor it was in America's interest to lose, nor it was in the America's interest for American allies to lose faith in US commitments to defend them and take unilateral actions to ensure their security. One such action could be some kind of accommodation with the Soviet Union. The other one could be other countries gaining nuclear weapons. which could start a crisis with the Soviet Union, or if the war happened, from American perspective, meant that certain allies could use nuclear weapons in a way contrary to US interest and basically bring the United States into the war. And this situation called for additional US measure to strengthen deterrence, to strengthen assurance, over the top of what already has been done at the time, right? So in addition to forward presence of conventional American forces in Europe, forward presence of American nuclear weapons in Europe, some of which were assigned for use by certain allies in wartime if US president allowed it. That was and is the central point of so-called nuclear sharing arrangements. And these new deterrence and reassurance measures included, first, improving consultations and joint planning between the United States and allies, which led to the establishment of the NPG, so the NATO Nuclear Planning Group, and the adoption of NATO's flexible response strategy, both in 1967. Now, the latter included a concept to which I will return many times today, and I'm sorry, it might be abstract, it may be technical at some point, but it is important for this subject. So the concept of limited use of nuclear weapons. It was basically, the idea was to use maybe one or a couple of warheads at the beginning, for example, at the advancing Soviet troops, to basically send a signal to the Soviets, stop the aggression, or we will escalate further. But at the same time, the idea was to avoid a total nuclear war from the outset, as this would not be credible. And if you compare practice to theory, this strategy was similar in its logic to the concept of a threat that leaves something to a chance, or manipulation of risk, both concepts coined by Thomas Schelling, a later winner of the Nobel Prize. Schelling's idea was that total nuclear war could happen even despite the intentions of nuclear powers involved in a crisis, because things always may get out of hand. And if you have two nuclear countries using nuclear weapons, even to a limited extent, there can always be some kind of misinterpretation, what is limited and what is not. And the idea was to basically manipulate the risk of this going out of hand. So the Schelling's idea was, whoever is more determined, whoever has more resolve in such a crisis will win, and the other side will back down. Now, as is well known, France was not convinced by such theories and US efforts. After already acquiring its own nuclear weapons, France never joined the NPG to underscore its independence, and eventually left NATO military structures for some 40 years. In contrast, the British, who acquired the national nuclear deterrent earlier, have cooperated closely with the United States on nuclear deterrence, including through joint planning, but also through buying US submarine-launched ballistic missiles, which to this day are used by the British to carry their own nuclear warheads. Now, enough with Cold War history. Ultimately, as we know, nuclear deterrence has not failed back then. Later, I think what is important to remember, nuclear deterrence was for a very long time marginalized in NATO. For most countries in NATO, thinking about nuclear weapons revolved mostly around arms control and disarmament, especially in those countries in which there were strong anti-nuclear movements and sentiments during the Cold War, like Germany. It was only Russia's first attack on Ukraine in 2014 which spurred NATO to relearn and adapt nuclear deterrence. And now most of discussions on nuclear weapons in NATO center around deterring a Russian nuclear attack, although I would argue that the perspective of nuclear war makes any conflict less likely. Now, today it seems, let's address the elephant in the room. Today it seems that we may very well be at the turning point in the history of NATO, depending on the decisions that could be made by the Trump administration in the coming weeks and months and years, including on relations with Russia, including on peace deal between Russia and Ukraine, and including on future US military presence in Europe. Now, it is not that NATO has not weathered various transatlantic tensions before. There were tensions not just about nuclear strategy, about which we talked already, but also about insufficient European spending on conventional forces, about trade, about balance of payments issue, about US unilateralism, about US nuclear talks with the Soviets. Today, however, the scale, the depth, and the amalgamation of all these problems at once loom as large, however, as never before, at least in my opinion. So the Trump administration vows to prioritize Asia over Europe much more than a few preceding administrations. Americans have been saying that Asia is the priority for quite some time, but actually since 2014, because of what Russians did, we have seen more US involvement and more US troops here in Europe. Trump is also seeking some kind of accommodation or reset with Russia, despite Russia's clear hostility towards NATO allies and the ongoing invasion of Ukraine. The US also puts much more pressure on European allies to extract greater military spending and concessions on economic issues or even internal politics here in Europe. And suggestions on making defense of allies conditional or even floating the possibility of using force against certain allies by the US is a novelty compared to the pre-Trump era. Now, all this unescapably stokes concerns among the allies about the credibility of US commitment to Europe and its future. And while I would say it is by no means a foregone conclusion that the US will abandon Europe and European allies, it is no longer unthinkable that at some point the US might indeed leave NATO or do something that would fundamentally undermine US credibility as an ally. By this, I mean, for example, withdrawing most of forces from Europe, especially withdrawing forces from countries like mine, countries which are the most threatened by the Russian invasion, or making some kind of a deal with Russia or on Ukraine or broader European security that would be highly disadvantageous for Europeans. Now, current transatlantic tensions are even more concerning, given that they come on top of already ongoing earlier adverse trends affecting Europe's security and also stretching US resources and attention also in nuclear domain. So the post-Cold War order is being challenged by Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, who all increasingly cooperate with each other. Nuclear weapons play an important role in this competition, as we see, especially by Russian threats which accompany the invasion of Ukraine. And the world is also heading towards nuclear tripolarity, as China is quickly building up not just its conventional, but also nuclear forces, and will get relatively close to two nuclear superpowers, so the United States and Russia. So this was quite a bit of introduction. Today, I will make three main points. First, in any case, Europeans should contribute more, not just to conventional, but also to nuclear deterrence, to try to complicate Russian calculations, complement the US efforts as long as the US is still in NATO, and make up for any deficits in American credibility and capabilities. And this, by the way, because of the things I just rating China, Russia, nuclear threats, which I mentioned just before. Now, this would have been necessary even without Trump in office. The Biden administration at the end of its term was already looking for ways for Europeans to somehow contribute more to nuclear deterrence. Here, I will elaborate on options such as the role played by French and UK nuclear forces and increasing this role. This is something that I will welcome, certainly, as well as Europeans investing more in strategic non-nuclear capabilities like deep strike missiles. At the same time, I would also stress that Europe should continue to try to work with the United States wherever possible on maintaining and ideally enhancing nuclear deterrence. This is because in a purely military sense, I don't think Europeans can provide nuclear protection for the continent as credible militarily, again, as the US one, at least not quickly. And despite current tensions and shifts, US still declares it is committed to NATO and has interest in Europe, even if Trump administration defines those interests very transactionally, for example, in terms of selling arms to this ally or another ally. So as long as the US wants to defend its interest in Europe and remains engaged militarily to a meaningful extent, even if a reduced extent, but still meaningful, there would be some risk of triggering war, including nuclear war for the Russians with the US if they attack a US ally. Now, last but not least, we also need to think about worst case scenarios in which the US is out of Europe or entirely loses its credibility. So then we would have to ask ourselves questions: would France and the United Kingdom be willing and able to fill the gap in terms of nuclear deterrence left by the Americans? Or perhaps proliferation of nuclear weapons and more countries in Europe having nuclear weapons would be the only effective solution to continue keeping the Russians at bay from NATO. Now, before we go to what I want to present as recommendations for further discussion, let me have a closer look at what are we exactly trying to deter. So what is the Russian threat, including its nuclear dimension, the threat which will continue to haunt Europe regardless of whether the US remains committed to NATO or not. So Russian invasion of Ukraine is just the most blatant example of Russia's aggressiveness, but it is important to remember that the Russian agenda goes well beyond Ukraine. It is about reestablishing some sort of sphere of influence in Europe. In recent talks with the United States, the Russians have repeated their demands, which they made already before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which called for withdrawal of all NATO troops from Poland and other countries that joined the alliance after the Cold War. This would effectively make Central Eastern Europe, so the region from where I come from, vulnerable to Russian aggression and coercion. Now, and there are other examples of this Russian approach. You might recall Putin himself lamenting the fall of the Soviet Union, more recently saying that he is basically taking back lands which are historically Russian. And also, by the way, according to the 2023 plan for expansion of Russian armed forces, the focus is, of course, on building more forces in and around Ukraine, but Russians are also building up their forces along NATO borders, especially near the Baltics and Finland, which tells you something about their intent. Now, speaking about Russian nuclear weapons, they play not only a defensive role, but also support Russia's aggressive agenda. They are to divide, intimidate the West, and eventually discourage the West from responding to Russian actions in peacetime, crisis, and wartime. And this has been going for many years. During the annexation of Crimea, we have seen some Russian signaling, some exercises of Russian nuclear forces, Putin boasting about Russia being the top nuclear power. But this intimidation has simply grown much more intense. It became more pronounced during the ongoing full-scale invasion of Ukraine, where Russia was trying to deter the West from supporting the attacked state. And you may recall that we had some Russian exercises at the beginning of the war. So 3 years ago, Putin said in the morning, whoever tries to come stand in our way will suffer the consequences that he has never seen. There are some also more ambiguous warnings. In time, the Russians have been also sending some more tangible signals. They announced the deployment of nuclear weapons to Belarus, which borders with my country, Poland. There have been exercises of short and medium-range nuclear forces in Europe, the forces which would be used to target European nations particularly. Or more recently, there was the change of the Russian nuclear doctrine, and which lowered the declared threshold for use of nuclear weapons. Neither of these moves were direct threats of imminent nuclear use, but Russians are very keen to try to remind us that if the tensions escalate, they might use nuclear weapons. Now, I would say that even all these Russian threats and signals have failed to discourage the West from providing huge military assistance to Ukraine. They did have some effect. And this is important as we look into the future, because I would argue that if it wasn't for escalation fears in the West, especially at the early stages of the war, Ukrainians would have been in much better position today. You might recall, for example, there were a number of delays in provision of certain types of equipment like tanks, long-range missiles, and so on and so on. And you might remember that in mid-2022, the Russian forces in Ukraine were in a very bad state. The mobilized troops have not come yet to Ukraine in big numbers. The initial Russian force was very much weakened. the Ukrainians were counterattacking in the, north and south. So you can argue that if they were given much more at the time, they could have pushed the Russians much further away. And also, even though we have discussions today about sending some kind of a peacekeeping force to Ukraine, there is no appetite for sending troops right now into combat against the Russians to protect Ukrainians. And this alone could be seen by the Russians as a success of their intimidation. I suspect, by the way, that it has not been lost on the Russians that Donald Trump, both as a candidate and now president, have said a couple of times that this war can turn into the World War III. So what I'm saying is that if Russia manages to strike some satisfactory deal as regards seizing or ending this war, or if Russia wins the war militarily, I think they will credit that victory in part to their nuclear threats, that they will be emboldened to repeat the same tactic, so launching an attack or another state covered by nuclear threats. And this could be another attack on Ukraine. Perhaps this could be an attack on NATO member. Now, getting back to some maybe technical issues, but as I said, we need to discuss some of them. One cannot discuss the nuclear threat from Russia without briefly considering what would be the most likely way of Russia using nuclear weapons in Europe. So Russia maintains a large arsenal of short and medium-range nuclear weapons for regional use. This is much larger than the current US nuclear force in Europe, a short-range nuclear force in Europe. Russians have, according to US estimates, 1,000 to 2,000 nuclear warheads for these, as some call them, but I really don't like this name, non-strategic nuclear warheads or tactical nuclear forces. The US has 100, and in Europe. And this difference is due to the fact that after Cold War, there was, you might say, a shift in situation of Russia and the West. So during the Cold War, as we discussed, it was NATO who relied heavily on the first use of nuclear weapons, because it was the Soviet Union and the captive nations of Warsaw Pact that had the conventional superiority in terms of numbers of troops. Now, after Cold War, the Russians actually increased the role of nuclear weapons to counter the conventional superiority of the West, meaning the United States and its allies. Moreover, discussions among Russian strategists about nuclear use in regional conflict have been dominated by the concept of gradual limited employment or limited use of nuclear weapons. Again, meaning using nuclear weapons selectively about some well-picked targets, so rather not cities, but maybe some kind of a military installation or a critical infrastructure, to basically intimidate the other side and force the other side to stop fighting, to avoid Russian defeat in a conventional conflict, terminate the war on Russian terms. And as many of you may be thinking right now, it is very similar to the flexible response strategy of NATO that I mentioned from the Cold War. The main difference is that, as I said, the Russians are not nuclear weapons do not only play a defensive role in their strategy and actions, but also an offensive. And absolutely last thing in this segment, I think we should not go to extremes when we assess the possibility of Russia actually using nuclear weapons. What I mean is that we should be neither paralyzed by this prospect nor complacent about it. During the ongoing war, Russia clearly sought to deter NATO countries from joining the war, from intervening with their own troops. So from the very beginning, it was extremely unlikely that they would attack the alliance in retaliation for us giving them a tank or this kind of capability or other kind of capability. On the other hand, the cautionary note would be that we have not yet witnessed a situation in which Russia was on a verge of strategic defeat, in which it could not continue fighting conventionally. And that's when the probably Russian interest in using nuclear weapons would be particularly high. Now, the closest we got to this was in the fall of 2022, when the Russians were sending some signals that they might use nuclear weapons to stop Ukrainian counteroffensive in the south. Now, it is difficult to assess how credible this scenario was and what eventually persuaded Russia not to go nuclear. It definitely worried the United States at the time, which sent a number of warnings along with some allies to the Russians. This could have been a combination of issues. Russians managed to evacuate their large force from Kherson in the south of Ukraine and stabilize the line. They have been warned, according to various sources, by the US that if Russia uses a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, there will be massive conventional air and missile strikes against Russian forces in Ukraine to basically deny the Russians any gain from using a nuclear weapon there. And there were also, by the way, some warnings from some of Russia's partners, like India and China, that they would not like to see the use of nuclear weapons. Anyway, the conclusion here is that the Russians are eager to threaten using nuclear weapons. They are not that eager to use them, but we have to keep such possibility that they would use them in certain situations if they thought that the gain would be higher than a loss or cost of that doing, that this would be possible. Now, one thing that I would probably talk a lot more if we met 6 months ago would be the issue of the what the Americans call multi-theater challenge. Basically, the thing is that even if we set the transatlantic tensions aside, and even if we are not in a situation in which Russia is emboldened by how the war ended, there is the China angle, which I mentioned. So one risk related to China's growing conventional and nuclear forces is that if there is a war between US and China in the Pacific, that could be seen by the Russians as opening some opportunities here in Europe. Like they might, for example, think that the US would not risk 2 nuclear wars at the same time. The other thing is that as Chinese capabilities grow, and if you think about this risk of 2 wars happening at the same time, some US forces, including some some nuclear forces, would be engaged in Indo-Pacific, and they might not be available for operations here in Europe. This is why I said that it was already the Biden administration which started to encourage the allies to think how they can contribute more to deterrence in Europe. Okay, that is enough of scene setting, I would say. Let's go to maybe recommendations and some questions, as I don't have all the answers. But first issue, is there a chance for working with the Americans still on nuclear deterrence? Well, in theory, it is. There is one, because as the new defense secretary noted during his visit to Poland, to Brussels, and to other places, the European allies, according to new US administration, should take over the primary responsibility for conventional security of the continent, which implies that the nuclear deterrence will remain the prime task for the Americans. Actually, what is interesting is that if you look at what the experts related to the Republican Party and sympathetic to Trump have been writing for many months, actually many of them recommended US deploying more nuclear weapons in Europe. Now, in practical terms, I don't think this is realistic in current political climate, when the Americans are trying to have some kind of a reset with Russia, and also some arms control talks with the Russians and the Chinese, which probably will not succeed. But anyway, if that were to fail, and if the situation were to change, then maybe probably the Americans will be willing to do more on nuclear deterrence in Europe. Now, one particular option that I would argue should be worked out if this happens, again, and that's a big if, is extending participation in nuclear sharing, which I mentioned. In practice, this could mean at least assigning aircraft from additional countries to be able to carry American nuclear bombs, if given permission by US president during war. A further reaching option, albeit one more controversial politically, would include deploying US nuclear bombs to new countries. There would be a number of premises to do that. Both moves would make NATO nuclear forces more survivable. So the more potential targets for Russian attack, the more difficult for the Russians to destroy those forces preemptively or preventively. broader participation in nuclear sharing would actually amount to better burden sharing between the US and Europe. And it seems that nowadays that's the priority for the American administration, burden sharing. And I think that also including additional countries in nuclear sharing would send an additional signal of determination from NATO to Russia, especially if it was done on the basis of a joint decision of all NATO allies, as this would be a visible signal that NATO allies are not as sensitive about nuclear weapons as Russia thinks now or might think in the future. And this could be relatively easy, by the way, to at least have additional countries contribute aircraft to carry US nuclear weapons, because over a dozen of countries in Europe is buying F-35A multi-role fighter, all of which eventually will be certified for carrying US nuclear bombs. Now, unsurprisingly, and I wouldn't be myself if I didn't say that I think that my country, Poland, would be a prime candidate for joining nuclear sharing one way or the other if there is an opportunity. Again, big if. After all, NATO has been long stating that the broadest possible participation in nuclear sharing arrangements demonstrates NATO unity and resolve, which is a great phrase. That being said, if I look at the map, one could ask if it is really so, since no country that joined NATO after Cold War is involved in these nuclear sharing arrangements in any way. So if you look at current places of deployment of US nuclear weapons, which, by the way, are not confirmed officially by NATO, but I think everybody knows that these are Germany, Belgium, Italy, Netherlands, and possibly Turkey. These locations are not a result of a sound, up-to-date strategy, but rather a legacy of Cold War and where the weapons were when the Cold War ended. And one could also wonder what NATO has gained from sticking to self-restraints it imposed on itself in 1996, 1997 on non-deploying nuclear weapons further east. If Russia was expanding its nuclear forces in Europe anyway, NATO has been just modernizing NATO's nuclear forces and not expanding them, and not increasing their size. And as I mentioned, Russia is now deploying nuclear weapons, or at least is saying it is deploying nuclear weapons closer to NATO borders in Belarus. Now, getting to the most important things. So what I think Europeans can and should do. I will actually start with conventional capabilities, which should be strengthened substantially. Conventional capabilities cannot replace nuclear deterrence altogether. Their nuclear weapons remain unmatched when it comes to the ability to inflict major destruction very quickly. That being said, additional non-nuclear capabilities can either lower the odds of nuclear weapons being used or help in responding to such use. Now, let me be clear that the key rationale for what I'm saying here is to improve our own European security, not to placate the Americans. That being said, a more equitable burden sharing might actually help to keep Americans in and take away some of the excuses they might look for to punish Europeans for underspending on defense. And by the way, one might disagree with Trump and Trump administration about many things, but I would agree that Europe in general has underspent on defense for many, many years. And if it was different, we might have been in a much better situation today. Now, to begin with, we should be able to, as NATO, as Europeans, to defend forward, basically to stop any aggression in its tracks from any start. And we see by the example of Ukraine and the situation from the fall 2022, which I mentioned by purpose, that if the Russians manage to take some territory, and then if they are in danger of being evicted from that territory, that's when their potential interest in using nuclear weapons increases. So do not let that situation happen in the first place. Here, much more needs to be done to implement the plans NATO adopted at recent summits. Now, according to some leaks from the press, because the plans are obviously not publicly known, according to some information in I think it was German press last summer, NATO would need 35 to 50 brigades to counter a rebuilt Russian army. Now, by my rough counting, this is anywhere between 100,000 to some 250,000 additional soldiers. Where are we going to get them from under the current level of defense spending in Europe? And actually, we might need more than that. If this reporting was precise, we might need more than that, because the US is supposed to withdraw some forces from Europe and limit other contributions to Europe. We just don't know when, how, which units, and how many. So yes, frontline states like mine will probably do more than we have agreed to in NATO plans. My country will spend 5% of GDP on defense this year, and we are expanding our army. But I don't think that we and other allies can cover all the shortfalls ourselves. Now, one of key capabilities that I think various European countries can and should invest in are deep strike missiles. They are obviously necessary for conventional warfighting, as we see, but what the Ukrainians are doing and want to do. You need to strike deep into the Russian territory if you are at war with Russia to counter Russian forces, military infrastructure, war industry, and supporting facilities like refineries. But deep strike missiles can also support nuclear operations in various ways. So they could be used to strike the elements of enemy's air defense system and make it easier for your side's aircraft or missiles with nuclear warheads to get through. They could be used to strike the launchers of conventional and nuclear missiles that could be used in Europe. And in some cases, a massive conventional missile strike could be a way to respond to a limited nuclear use. I underscore, in some situations, it would depend on a number of factors. What damage did the Russian strike cause? How many missiles do we have available? What targets have we hit? What targets are available to be hit still? So obviously, this wouldn't be a total substitution for nuclear weapons, but it would be an additional response option short of using nuclear weapons. And in this aspect, Europe is getting better in the sense that many countries are buying additional missiles. My country is buying some 800 US-made JASM air-launched cruise missiles. They have like 1,000-kilometer range. We are buying several hundred of US and Korean-made rocket artillery launchers with ranges up to 300 kilometers. But there is one big gap. There are several gaps, but the biggest one in European missile capabilities concerns medium-range missiles. They can strike at ranges between 1,000 to 3,000 kilometers. Nobody has them except France and the United Kingdom, although in still, I would say, limited numbers. By my rough count, these are around 500 sea-launched missiles compared to, for example, a few thousand of comparable US systems. So here I would very specifically argue that Europe should accelerate the work on what is called ELSA initiative. It was started back in June by France, Germany, Italy, and Poland. Now it includes also UK and Sweden. And the idea is to jointly procure, jointly develop and buy these kinds of deep strike systems. I would even say that this should be a flagship European defense acquisition program supported by joint EU funding and with co-production of missiles in various countries. Now, one additional, before we go to really explosive nuclear stuff, one additional non-nuclear capability that I would say needs to be strengthened still, it is being strengthened, but much more needs to be done, is air and missile defense across Europe. Now, while air and missile defense cannot guarantee a total protection against a large missile attack, especially against a nuclear attack, a strong air defense system can have a high chance of intercepting more limited strikes. And recent experiences from Ukraine and from Israel prove that this might be actually the case. And why is this important? Because if we do have a strong integrated air and missile defense system in Europe, this could undermine Russian confidence in conducting a limited nuclear attack, right? So in such case, they would have to consider launching a bigger strike, which could be more escalatory, meaning that it could more likely elicit a forceful response from the West. So let's get back to nuclear deterrence and let's discuss French and British nuclear forces. To me, as somebody coming from an allied state that could be a target of Russian aggression, there is no question that France and the United Kingdom should strengthen their contribution to collective security here in Europe in terms of nuclear deterrence. I would also add that of the two countries, France has more to offer in this regard, given that France has slightly bigger and more diverse nuclear arsenal. But it is, of course, up to both countries' sovereign decisions whether they want to, they are willing to take additional costs and risks associated with that. Now, I must confess that I feel both privileged but somewhat pretentious as a Pole to speak in English about French nuclear deterrence at the University of Paris. But this is a conversation important for my country and region as well. Some year ago, both the President and Prime Minister of Poland expressed their interest in having this dialogue with France. And President Macron repeatedly called for partners to share their views on the role of French nuclear forces in European security. So let me just offer you some thoughts. Obviously, there has been already a lot of debate, I know, about this in France, internationally. Many distinguished experts have expressed their ideas about it, as Alois present here. So I will just mention the ideas that I find especially useful. So if we talk about enhancing the role of French and British contributions to nuclear deterrence in Europe, beyond asking what is politically feasible, you need to ask what is the primary goal of such enhancement. Right now, despite all the transatlantic tensions, I would argue that the goal is that we should still frame such effort as better complementing, not replacing US nuclear deterrence in Europe. Here, I will just say that since 1974, all NATO allies agree that French and British nuclear forces contribute to strengthening of allied deterrence. More precisely, the current 2022 NATO strategic concept notes that these allies' separate centers of decision-making contribute to deterrence by complicating the calculations of potential adversaries. Now, this NATO language basically means that if Russians were considering using a nuclear weapon, they have to consider US response, which could be a unilateral one or the one with nuclear sharing participants, a British response, and a French response. And this formulation, which I cited, by the way, very much reflects the thinking of some French strategists from the time France acquired first nuclear weapons, like General André Boff, and excuse me my pronunciation. If, in turn, the Americans were to withdraw their nuclear protection from Europe entirely or lose their credibility fundamentally, the requirements for European nuclear powers in terms of additional capability, signaling, and cooperation with allies would be much higher. So let us start with discussing potential changes to declaratory policy, right? So the phrasing, which basically says when a state can use a nuclear weapon. It is pretty much straightforward in the case of United Kingdom, which, as the United States, declares that it may use its nuclear forces to defend NATO allies. French policy is more ambiguous, as President Macron repeatedly stated. The French vital interests, which are to be protected by nuclear deterrence, have a nuclear dimension, which implies that France could use nuclear weapons to defend its allies. While I think from perspective of an ally, this statement is welcome, in my opinion, it's too ambiguous, again, from a perspective of an ally. And I express this opinion while fully appreciating how sensitive this issue is here in France, both politically, due to history as well. And I took notice of some of the responses here to President Macron's offer. That being said, if we set that historical and political sensitivities aside, I don't really see a strategic reason why a more concrete declaration would cross the apparent French red lines of maintaining independence in nuclear deterrence or maintaining some room of maneuver in a crisis. After all, neither the United States nor the United Kingdom say that they will use nuclear weapons to defend an ally. They say they may use nuclear weapons to defend an ally. So there is ambiguity and room for maneuver there. And I would also differentiate different types of ambiguity. There could be good ambiguity and bad ambiguity, I would say. So an option to do something should be, in my opinion, clearly on the table so that the aggressor understands what might happen to him. Now, this doesn't mean that one has to be very specific what the response to aggression would be, right? If you maintain some ambiguity on that, it may complicate the adversary assessment whether this action would trigger this or that response. But the option, I think, needs to be on the table. So I would say that a clear commitment from my allied perspective on the possibility of using a nuclear weapon to defend an ally would be desirable in any case. It would be absolutely necessary if France made the decision to actually try to replace the United States as a main deterrence provider in Europe if the US was no longer with us here. Short of that, again, there has been a lot of discussion. There are other options for stronger declaratory policy, which in current situation would also bring some added value, although not as much as the one that I mentioned. There is, for example, the 1994 Chequers statement between President Chirac and Prime Minister Major, where President Chirac stated that the vital interests of one of these countries could not be threatened without the vital interests of another being equally at risk, which again implies the possibility of using nuclear weapon to, in this case, defend Britain. So this could be repeated in another bilateral format, for example, or with regards to all EU partners. Let's turn towards capabilities. As I said, we will not escape technical considerations here. Most broadly speaking, if France and the United Kingdom were to play a much bigger role in nuclear deterrence in Europe, increase in their nuclear forces side would be an important political signal, especially in the French case, because it would send a signal that now this bigger arsenal is not just to defend France, it is also supposed to defend allies as well. If you look at this from more, let's say, operational or military side, actually it's the British nuclear arsenal which needs expansion to greater extent. And this, please bear with me, this where it might get a little bit abstract, but that's what we need to go through. So this has to do with capabilities to respond to a limited nuclear attack, right? So the prevalent thinking is that you need to respond proportionally to such an attack, right? To show that you can respond but not cause the Russians to respond in an escalatory way. And there are various ways of proportionality. One is picking a target. If they attack an airbase, you don't necessarily start with attacking Moscow. You know what the response would be. If they use a relatively small warhead, you might also want to use one. Now, UK theoretically has some lower yield or lower power nuclear warheads on some of its submarine-launched Trident missiles, ballistic missiles. I think this option is problematic given that as I advocated for improving air and missile defense in NATO, Russians are also improving theirs. So at some point they might get the ability to intercept even an intercontinental ballistic missile if it's just one missile. Another one is these sea-launched or intercontinental range ballistic missiles are associated with massive retaliation, right? Because their main task is to be launched in big numbers, mostly against cities, depending on the country, but mostly against cities. So the fear is that if the UK, for example, use just one, the Russians will see this coming on their radars and they will basically launch their whole nuclear force in retaliation, believing that it's a part of a bigger attack. Now, I don't believe the Russians would risk committing suicide by mistake, but it's not up for me to decide. I wouldn't be pushing the proverbial button, but the leader of US, UK, or France. So what I'm getting at is that the UK would gain from getting an additional, shorter range, maybe stealthier system which wouldn't be associated with this massive retaliation capability. So basically a sea-launched or air-launched cruise missile. Now, France, in turn, has already some estimated 50 air-launched nuclear cruise missiles carried by Rafale aircraft. Now, the question would be whether this stockpile and the doctrine, which basically says how it could be used, whether they would be enough to counter the threat of Russian gradual strikes. Because Russian strategy basically says we might use nuclear weapons, or strategic thinking by the Russians, right? That they might use a couple of nuclear weapons. If this doesn't work, we might repeat that, right? With another wave of strikes. So from this standpoint, at the very least, a change in French nuclear doctrine would be advisable from Allied perspective, because the French nuclear doctrine says there could be one single nuclear final warning shot, which I would argue was a very credible concept for a Cold War scenario when it was basically introduced, right? So the scenario was that the Soviet forces were getting close to the French border. Then France launches a limited nuclear strike to basically say, stop. If they don't stop, France launches its nuclear weapons massively, which to me would be credible, right? Because France would be facing a credible and existential, threat. I don't think that the single warning shot concept would be that credible with regards to Russia contingency today and some kind of escalation and nuclear strikes being launched at countries like mine, for example. So additional question, of course, is if you change the doctrine, do you need more missiles? Probably yes. Let me add 2 more points on capabilities. On the bright side, and we are again going very deep into the Cold War again. If you presume that Americans are still in NATO, both French and UK nuclear forces could theoretically play a role of what was called by General de Gaulle and others in France as a nuclear trigger or a nuclear detonator. So basically, the idea is that the use of these forces could bring US into nuclear exchange with Russia, and both US and Russia should take this into consideration before doing anything. What I mean is that if, say, UK or France launch a limited nuclear attack against Russia, then the Russians might not know where it's coming from, might strike against the US might reply, and there you have it, you have a big nuclear war. And actually, having that possibility, I think, is good for deterrence, although I just wouldn't base the main mechanism of European nuclear deterrence on such a accidental thing. Now, second, what I am afraid France and UK nuclear forces would not be able to do in the foreseeable future, if any time, is to pose what, again, excuse me using some maybe lofty or abstract terms, but what the Americans call counterforce capability, which basically counterforce capability in this setting means that the US has so many nuclear weapons, so many precise non-nuclear missiles, so many cyber attack capabilities, so many attack submarines that they could still take out a large portion of Russian nuclear forces, including the intercontinental range nuclear forces. Now, why I'm saying this? Because the Russians keep talking about it. I mean, to me, I cannot imagine US president in any case authorizing such a strike on Russia, because the chance, as we discussed, that a large number of Russian launchers would survive and the Russians would retaliate against the Americans is just too high. That being said, if you listen to Russian commentators, military, Putin himself, even sometimes, they keep on talking about it. So they apparently fear it. The big question is, of course, how important this is for deterrence. Maybe in their minds, this is something that would make an escalation from a limited war, conventional or nuclear, up to total war credible. Again, we don't know. The deterrence is always in the mind of the one we are trying to deter. Now, the next point is that a greater contribution to nuclear deterrence in Europe would also require better signaling of intent to use nuclear weapons in defending allies, not just by words, but also by deeds. The furthest reaching option, the one I presume would be politically plausible only in case of US withdrawal from Europe, if at all, would be nuclear sharing, right? So forward deploying nuclear weapons on territories of some allies and involving them in potential use of these weapons in wartime if given permission. Again, also something not just politically controversial, as I'm sure, but it would likely also require an expansion of French nuclear force so that both national and allied requirements for potential use of nuclear weapons would be fulfilled. There are some options that are more plausible right now. I won't go through all of them, but for example, you might imagine French strategic aviation having some kind of constant presence in allied bases, for example, in Poland. Of course, we do take note of these Rafales showing up on Polish and Baltic skies, and I am thankful for it, although they are there mainly as in their conventional role for air policing, so basically intercepting Russian aircraft which do not abide by the rules of behavior in international airspace. Now, bigger role in nuclear deterrence could also involve a bigger presence of French conventional forces on the eastern flank, as attack on these conventional forces would increase the risk that situation would escalate to nuclear war, right? So today you have major French forces in Romania, smaller ones in Estonia and Lithuania, but for example, no constant presence in Poland. So maybe to somehow close the subject of French and British nuclear forces, this was quite a long list of options, or a wish list, if you will. So to sum it up, some of these changes should be relatively easy to implement, others will require major investments or political changes. But in general, and provided that there is political will, greater involvement of French and UK nuclear forces in deterrence on our continent would be the quickest way to try to fill the gap after the Americans, at least partially, which would be undoubtedly an advantage of such solution. The question would be whether such construct, even if fully implemented, would suffice to deter the Russians, given the lack of certain characteristics of US arsenal, which I mentioned. Another question is, what would France expect from its allies in return? Right? Some commentators, for example, not from France actually, from what I know, propose, for example, co-financing of enlarging French nuclear force. France has not called for it. I don't know whether France would want it. Now, do we still have 5 to 10 minutes, or not necessarily?
No, 5.
Because I just wanted to actually maybe address the most explosive issue, because if you imagine post-American Europe, in which either the France and UK do not step up when it comes to nuclear deterrence, or if they do, but the allies basically don't believe in it, then you have just one option left, which is nuclear proliferation. We can nuclear proliferation, countries, so additional countries acquiring nuclear weapons. But I think we might have some questions about that. So for the sake of the discussion, I will probably stop here. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much, Artur, thank you so much for giving us so many points, questions, and interesting comments, just maybe to get the ball rolling before giving the floor to the room. One thought, it seems to me that the Cold War period, or the post-Cold War period, rather resulted in renationalization of nuclear postures around the idea that nuclear ring-fenced vital interests, the territory, the population, the fundamental interests of states. We saw that for China, also for Russia in a way, in its compliance in some respects of the Budapest Memorandum and other countries didn't want to extend their arsenal in other European NATO countries that benefited from the positioning of nuclear weapons under their control, so the United States, and seemed that there was a move towards the renationalization of nuclear weapons. And the remaining American forces in Europe were aging in a way, and they were here to mark the continuation of geopolitical solidarity with old allies, and the oldest amongst them, as you mentioned, but that was also possibly a leftover from the Cold War, the goat on a post. And so the Russians would strike Europe first before striking the US if there was an escalation into nuclear war. So striking Europe first before striking the US if there was a Russian response. So this was a sort of leftover. Each time NATO keeps repeating that there is a nuclear strategy and doctrine in the alliance, but we are hard put finding really the expression of this doctrine, which is aligned with the current era, but also the past decades. But even in the past decades, we rather saw that nuclear pressure over Europe becoming lighter, and you showed it. The aggression against Ukraine showed that it was no longer a time for arsenal reduction and non-proliferation. It was rather a new rationale for new players being involved, a vertical proliferation in the arsenals of nuclear powers, starting with Russia, as you said, but also China and the US, and also France, which is going to modernize and will move on to a third generation of nuclear weapons. So it's against this backdrop that, in a rather unexpected way, the extension of French deterrence and British deterrence within to the rest of Europe, this question is asked. So that's the first question. Is it a response to the end of the US nuclear umbrella over Europe? And how would it be possible to substitute something else for this umbrella with nuclear solidarity, although we can see what the difficulties would be in having this extension? The European issue is the fact that the European territory is so small. All the other countries, in their deterrence, they have conventional deterrence. What you have talked about, the development of anti-air defense, they have nuclear deterrence and huge territories. Of course, you can strike Moscow, but you can strike other peripheral targets that are not too close to Moscow. But if you strike Europe, you're going to hit a nerve center or huge population centers immediately. So that makes theoretical thinking more complicated, because we would like to find a satisfactory strategic balance in Europe and not come back to the conflictuality of a balance of terror purely between Europe and Russia. So that's a real question, and in a way, that's an implicit answer to the easy way out of happy proliferation in Europe. Because if you look at the issue of US weapons positioned in Europe, it's not so much their number that they would like to change, rather their technical specificities that they would like to change. Now, that being said, about Europe, about France, you were talking about positive or not positive ambiguity. Well, we can see that deterrence, before being about ambiguity, it's about credibility. So the French deterrence doctrine is still credible in protecting the French territory, its population, and so that we can never suffer a conventional massive attack. And as soon as you extend it, well, that ambiguity will run counter to the credibility of those assurances. So these are so many questions that hark back probably to a kind of declaration of principles, statement of principles made by France, by Chirac and Mitterrand even before him, that in the post-Cold War context, our deterrence was here to reassure other countries. But I remember what Mitterrand said, and even Chirac. They were here to build a common and shared destiny for Europe. So a shared destiny, that means that, well, we could see that there would be a several-tiered Europe with different appraisals of the democratic context and what values should be protected. It's not as homogeneous as we expected them to be in the 90s or early aughts, even in the 2010s. So, of course, we could build solidarity of fates with others if we assume that we've got the same fates and destiny, and if we project ourselves to the same history of solidarity and shared union and strengthening of the democratic values that Europe was founded on. So that's a real question. And if we are to have this debate again in France, of course, it will be around that. We talked about the Chequers agreement. Well, I'm very happy to see the change because I observed that there was a blocked position by the Germans in the 90s. There was no way to talk about that because as soon as you talked about nuclear weapons, the Germans were up in arms against it, and so it was impossible. So we were just about converging our strategic doctrines, and so that was impossible to even broach that. But in the last few years, I'm happy to see that now a dialogue is possible. And now with the British, after the Chequers agreement, after the Lancaster House Treaty, we have gone further with the British, even talking about cooperation in terms of potential weapons manufacturing, but it was a dead end. Also, potentially having operational cooperation, we're doing that non-officially, but all these matters are extremely complicated. So I think that in a way, if there were to be strategic dialogue, and as you've proposed yourself, it is based on 3 items that will help test everybody's willingness and credibility. Intermediate strike missiles, conventional ones, and new missile families, how European manufacturers and the possibility of having nuclear warheads against the Russians. Well, how can we test those missiles? Are we able to manufacture and have joint ownership of a deep strike capability with conventional missiles? That's the question. How do we manufacture them? How do we test them? How do we maintain them? And secondly, about the same strategic dialogue on missile defense. We've seen projects, the German project and a competing project, and so the Europeans couldn't agree on the way to develop those warning capabilities and interception capabilities themselves. And thirdly, there's nuclear deterrence. If you weave these 3 threads together, very quickly you're able to find something that is consistent in the definition of a strategic doctrine. Now, if we put the burden of proof on a kind of Europeanization of French deterrence or even the British deterrence, we'll reach the same conclusions. So a discourse that says that, yes, opportunistically or based on opportunity, France will decide whether it includes the protection of this or that ally in its vital interests. But that's a real question. Is there a body, a core of countries in Europe that are ready to address these 3 matters together and invest together and invest based on European strategic autonomy? That's the real question. And then after that, we can talk about nuclear deterrence. But we should start with the simplest things, deep strikes and missile defense. We should first agree on that, and then we can pull the thread on nuclear. But I'll let you respond to that, and then we'll move on to questions with the room.
Sir, and for the questions. Let's start with medium-range missiles. Yeah, I think it's an easy one. France has already, at least French defense industry already offered to put those medium-range cruise missiles, which are on French ships, on land. Which, by the way, would be a quick solution to, I think, deploy these kinds of capabilities in large numbers on land in Europe. as regards missile defense, I think I don't know if I got the translation right, if I heard it right, but I think it's a question for the Germans. I mean, Poland is buying like what, 8 Patriot batteries, and we will be buying more stuff. So I think it's probably a different conversation. But I will not escape from the nuclear deterrence part, because I do have a couple of points here. So first of all, again, I don't want to be pretentious. Again, a Polish guy arguing with French professor. But I don't really think that if France makes the decision that it wants to, I know you don't like this word, extend, so cover allies with a nuclear protection. It's French decision. I don't think it would in any way put the credibility of defense of France in question. I mentioned Thomas Schelling today, and he wrote also that actually saying that you will use nuclear weapons to defend your own country is not even a threat. It's a warning. You don't have to make this, except for some technical issues, you don't have to make this credible. Because if you're threatened, if your existence is threatened, you will use all means at your disposal. So I don't think that extending somehow the area covered by French nuclear deterrence would undermine that. The reason is whether France is ready to declare that and invest in certain things, and what would it expect from allies, in addition maybe to things you mentioned here. Now, definitely speaking about medium-range missiles, just yesterday or 2 days before, there is the chief of staff of Polish armed forces saying that, yes, we are getting medium-range conventional missiles. The question is when, from whom, whether we will be able to produce them in Poland as well. Poland is in this ELSA initiative, so I can speak for the government, but it seems that there's interest in that. There are also South Korean possibilities and American possibilities to do that if it doesn't work out. As for testing, I mean, how does France test its nuclear and conventional missiles right now? I think you have some testing ranges to do that. Also, ballistic missiles. Well, I think it would be the same in case of this conventional INF. A couple of other comments. Now, as regards, if I got your remarks right, neglecting the collective dimension of nuclear deterrence, yes, it was. I agree, it was neglected in NATO. Although, not to be that critical, there is an adaptation going on since 2014. I would just say that the pace could be faster. So, for example, actually, since the end of the Cold War till, I think, 2022, there was actually no joint planning of nuclear use of nuclear weapons in NATO. Now, it's very good that in 2022 or 2023, allies finally agreed that, well, we should have new plans because, well, the map and situation somehow changed. So again, you might think that it's a glass half full, half empty. We did that, but late. In 2021, NATO declassified the name of its annual nuclear exercise, Steadfast Noon, which is good that we did that. But, just having so much controversy around just declassifying a name of your exercise, when Russians do all those things, having exercises whenever they want, however they want, just shows you that there is still some sensibility about nuclear issues in the alliance. And if I were to take an issue with some of the allies, I don't mean France here, is that, yeah, I too often, also during this conflict, you could hear a NATO leader saying that, oh, we are afraid of escalation if we get this to the Ukrainians or that, and the Russians might escalate. I mean, we should take escalation concerns seriously, but I would prefer much more for allies of NATO countries to actually express confidence in NATO nuclear deterrence. And I think it's both welcome, but also somewhat, I don't know if ironic is the right thing, that on the first day of Russian invasion of Ukraine, it was the French foreign minister who said publicly that, oh, we need to remind the Russians that NATO is a nuclear alliance, that Atlantic Alliance is a nuclear alliance. And I'm saying that this is a kind of ironic because obviously France contributes to nuclear deterrence in Europe, but it's the only country which is not in NATO nuclear planning group. Yet it was France who had to say that unambiguously at the time. If you can remind if there are any questions left that I didn't answer, I can get back to that because there was lots on the table.
No, merci.
Well, thank you. Thank you for adding to these thoughts with these answers, explaining your position. My position is rather about going towards European nuclear protection to which France would contribute. But I wouldn't want us to just, build that on empty words. So if we are building something together, we will all contribute with our own means, or we'll always face the same stumbling blocks and, incomplete dialogues like the ones that I discussed. Let's remember that with the UK, negotiations started as early as 1991 with cooperation on rescue and so on, and strategic consultation on nuclear with the Germans that started in 95. Sorry for the historical reminders, but since the same causes will always produce the same effects, if we don't draw the Europeans into a strategic dialogue, those who want it, Austria or Hungary won't come back on their positions of principle, but I think that with a number of countries, the UK, Poland, Germany, all those who want to be involved in this construction. But as a strategic player, the Europeans would start to take charge of their collective safety. They won't hide behind a potential American reassurance at a time when when it's deeply weakened by what Trump says. I don't want really to chase ghosts here. So if there is to be a dialogue, if it's well based on these three aspects, because now these three aspects are connected, then I think that something can work. Regarding a final nuclear warning, in a way, with their missiles on the Dnieper and their gesticulations, the Russians have shown how far, for them, their safety interest extended. The nuclear signal makes sense. The Russians said, don't cross some lines, in particular in your support to belligerents, especially by not becoming belligerents yourselves, because we consider that the Ukrainian conflict has a nuclear dimension. They've said that very clearly. And so the nuclear signal, who sends it and how far does it go? So could there be a nuclear signal given by a final warning, potentially by a very low intensity warhead? I won't get into the details, but that does matter. It does matter because it shows the aggressor that from that point onwards, then you tip over from a conventional conflict into a conflict that could become nuclear. That's what the Russians did, including with the shooting of missiles over Dnieper. And so, although that was very well discussed and it was in line with the Cold War rationale, it does have its importance. And you're right to highlight that. It's no longer like during the Cold War, where we can weave through the cracks, and the issue of the invisible trigger no longer exists. Now we know for sure who will have shot the shot, even a small intensity warhead. The one who does that is the one running the risk of a response strike. So we fully understand that the Americans would not support, maybe, and for nuclear players, a first strike. I'd like to say that the Chinese do not advocate for first strikes in doctrines like ours. We never forbade ourselves to shoot first, but that exposes you to consequences. And so, hoping that the signal would have been understood enough by everybody that it's escalating and we need to stop. And here, you need to lend credibility to such signals. And I think that now we need to give the floor to the students for their questions. A gentleman at the top first. Well, the first one near you. We'll take 3 questions.
Monsieur Kacprzyk, pour votre intervention.
Thank you so much for your talk. I wanted to ask you, we were talking about proliferation, an explosive notion in a worst case scenario where Poland was to build its own nuclear capabilities. What capabilities would it have? What abilities would it have to enrich uranium to military grade? Is Poland able to do that in the mid to long term?
Your words. So you talked about the fact that we are lacking some diversity in our missile capabilities, and also you mentioned the efficiency of the Iron Dome used by Israel. So my questions are, well, what about the cost efficiency of this Iron Dome? Is it possible to have such capability against a real threat like Russia is, as far Europe is concerned? And on the other hand, what about our gap in MHD technology? And isn't it the real reason to have European funds, because we are, well, behind the Russians as far hypersonic missiles are concerned?
Bonjour et merci pour votre intervention.
Thank you. It was rather a quick comment to echo what you said. I think that there is something that has not been discussed. It's joint training in terms of deterrence. It's something I've been talking about for a long time, with the involvement of European countries on poker. And I think that for some reasons it was a bit difficult, but this is really something that should be pushed further. Maybe we could involve Europeans in poker, and maybe we could have an equivalent, a steadfast European poker in Poland, the merits of which would be to show consistency. And here I think that the French and British arsenals are way enough to deter Russia, at least in the short run. That should show European credibility, and that goes through joint exercises in the deployment of forces in Europe with models and so on. And so I would like to have your opinion on that. Would Poland be interested in such exercises, in welcoming and hosting such exercises on its grounds, on its territory? Is it something that is discussed amongst countries? Yes, well, I'll let Artur answer. And yes, that's true, but he's already discussed it, because talking about the potential pre-positioning of French or British nuclear weapons, and the first echelon of that would be the demonstration effect and presence of forces, of nuclear forces in some countries. That would be educational. Thank you.
Questions, not all of them easy ones, but yeah, I would support. I would very much support. I think there would be support for having some kind of French also nuclear exercises in Poland as a signaling towards Russia. I would recommend for Poland to participate in French nuclear exercises actively if this was possible. I think there was, as Alois also noted in some of her analyses, that Italian air refueling aircraft once participated in French nuclear exercises, so it seems to be possible. I would recommend for Poland to contribute its own aircraft there. We don't have air refuelers, but for a long time, our F-16 aircraft do participate in NATO's Steadfast Noon exercise, not in nuclear role, but as a kind of support for nuclear armed aircraft, right? So either they can escort them or maybe they can attack air defenses. I would like to see that also in exercises with French strategic aviation. What is more, I would recommend, as long as Americans are in and we have NATO and we do some things about nuclear deterrence in NATO, you can, for example, imagine having NATO's annual nuclear exercise, Steadfast Noon, and poker exercise, maybe some kind of a sequence. So one happening after another, or maybe them happening at the same time, to send the signal that even though France is not in the nuclear planning group and so on, this is a concerted effort. And here, Professor, I would argue that as regards hiding behind American reassurance, I would argue with you about this in the sense that I would like my country to have as many security guarantees as possible. American, European. As regards nuclear weapons, well, this gets complicated. And this is a great question, by the way. So if there was, like, this is my opinion, but also expressed by some other experts, I think, in the discussion. Like, for example, I recommend reading a piece by Fabian Hoffmann from Oslo University. He wrote a great piece recommending that if there is to be a proliferation of nuclear weapons in Europe, it should be a joint program with multiple countries taking place. And by the way, there is a historical precedent for that. In 1957, there were the FIG, so French, Italian, German treaties to produce nuclear weapons and missiles, which were unsurprisingly, as many of you know, terminated by General de Gaulle, who wasn't a great fan of Germany having nuclear weapons some 20 or 25 years after the Second World War. But anyway, if there was to be a proliferation, I think this would be the most practical way. Obviously, and we are really, really going into political fiction right now, but obviously it would be the best if one or two European nuclear powers were in there to share technology. But even without that, having a joint program could help overcome some difficulties to which I think one of the questions hinted at. Like, the biggest difficulty is that if, for example, my country wanted to acquire nuclear weapons, right? So one of the biggest difficulties is that we don't have the luxury that France and United Kingdom had in the 50s. In the sense that we are discussing here a scenario in which the US is out of Europe, right? And France and UK, even despite some French doubts about American nuclear umbrella, did acquire nuclear weapons under American umbrella. And before the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed, and there weren't those export controls, sanctions regimes, it was much more difficult then to detect a nuclear program. Russians did not have the capabilities to detect and attack such a program as they do have right now. So let's imagine that Americans are out of Europe and my country or some other country, because I don't think that Poland would be the only one in the alliance considering that, wants to develop nuclear weapons. So one threat is that the Russians will simply prevent, right? Like the Israelis attacked Iraqi or Syrian nuclear reactors. Indeed, one of the problems is that we don't really have what we can call nuclear latent countries in Europe. So countries which have most of the infrastructure, technology, and materials necessary to build a nuclear bomb quickly. Well, some countries are in better position. You have this uranium enrichment plant in the Netherlands, a smaller one in Germany. Germany, from what I recall, they have some small stocks of highly enriched uranium. Maybe not enough for a credible nuclear arsenal, but to get some bombs too. In Polish case, we would probably have to reprocess plutonium from our only research reactor, which could be done. I'm not a physicist. From what I hear, it probably would be a few weapons in a few years. So very again, time-demanding process. And obviously, this would likely be noticed by International Atomic Energy Agency, right? So there's the fear of being detected. Or we have some uranium deposits, but we would have to build uranium reprocessing plant, which again would likely be noticed. Which is why I'm saying that a joint effort would be better, because then you could combine knowledge, combine materials, lower the costs, and also make it more difficult for the Russians to take out such a European nuclear program. They would have to strike basically more facilities. That being said, I don't know. I can say it about my country. I think Ukraine. I think some of that could apply to Ukraine. That developing nuclear weapons by European states would be difficult, risky, and costly. Although, desperate people do desperate things. That's how I would put it. So if you talk about all these scenarios of US withdrawing, making bad deals, and so on, I mean, Americans can really open the Pandora's box with that. That's what I would leave it. And I think the last question is hypersonic missiles. Sure, I am all for that. I think the UK at least is working on some future hypersonic air-launched cruise missile. I think the next French nuclear-armed cruise missile will be a hypersonic one. I would love them. I would love hypersonic missiles to be at the inventory of Polish armed forces. That being said, at this point, I think really looking at the things which can happen 3 years, 5 years from now, I would rather have an imperfect capability, missile capability, or any other one, but one which we could use in large numbers in 3 to 5 years, than wait for a perfect solution that we will have in 10 years. So I think this reflects how nervous, these remarks from my side, I think reflect how nervous some people, or quite actually, especially in recent weeks, many people in my country are as regards, what Russia can do after the war in Ukraine ceases some way. And the absolutely last question, efficiency of Iron Dome or any other air defense systems. You will never win with the offense. I agree with that, if that's the suggestion of your question. I will just get back to the premise of what I was saying, that if you have a strong air defense system, in terms of defending against a nuclear attack, maybe you will have the chance to stop a limited one, no chance for stopping a big one. So I'm not saying it can be supplemented. The other one, with conventional missiles, it's obviously different. If one conventional missile hit the target, or if one nuclear missile hit the target. And Ukrainians actually, they have been very good sometimes at intercepting, especially Russian cruise missiles. There were strikes where they intercepted several dozens of cruise missiles. So to some extent, I think it could be done, but it doesn't take away the need for us to have offense, conventional, nuclear. So I think I will stop here. Maybe some follow-ups.
Non, je vais passer.
Excellent. And now I'll give the floor to Alois Fayet, if you don't mind. So yes, please go ahead. And then we will take other questions. We'll expand. Well, I saw you, sir, Mr. Morales. But let's give the floor to Alois first.
Our presentation and for the many references to work by French think tankers on nuclear deterrence and the European dimension of the French vital interests. It's not always easy to talk about it in France, because there is this strong idea that only the president is able to talk about nuclear deterrence and to decide what to do with nuclear weapons. So of course, the ultimate power of decision-making is up to the president, but it doesn't mean that we can't talk about it. And I think it's also a great sign that a Polish researcher is here today to talk about European deterrence. I think it's a great signal of this Europeanization of the debate on nuclear deterrence. I think you really managed to underline all the issues related to nuclear deterrence, and not only the usual topics of the size of the arsenal or the credibility of the deployment of US bombs in Europe. It's really larger than that. And as you said, it's mostly, in fact, a matter of conventional credibility, because ultimately it's the lives of American soldiers in Europe that really carry the weight of nuclear deterrence, and not the 100 of B-61 gravity bombs in Germany or in the Netherlands. And we also see that, for example, with French soldiers that are deployed in Estonia or in Baltic states, the allies there, they tell us basically that they see the soldiers and it's almost like they are with the bomb on their back. And if they are killed, of course, their lives are almost more important than the lives of soldiers that comes from non-nuclear countries. But so anyway, so I had a couple of questions for you. So regarding, of course, the extension of, the ultimate, let's say, solution of nuclear proliferation in Europe. So of course, when there were these programs in the 50s, well, the non-proliferation treaty didn't exist at that time. And so even though the NPT is now quite in bad shape, like the other nuclear agreements or the rest of the arms control architecture, I would say that it was pretty efficient until now to prevent nuclear proliferation in the rest of the world, including in Europe and also in Asia. And honestly, I don't see now or even in 10 years how the article within the NPT that can allow some countries to withdraw from the NPT under the pretense that it's for the supreme interests of the countries could be activated. But I would be interested in your opinion on that, and also what the state of the debate in Poland regarding a possible withdrawal from the NPT, and also what will be the US reaction to that? Because nowadays, with this Trump administration, we could expect that maybe they really don't care and they would allow, for example, first South Korea, I think, to proliferate, and they will be okay with allied proliferation. But do you really want to bet on that? I would say. And my second question will be about the nuclear sharing arrangements. So putting it quite bluntly, have you been able, or at least have Poland been able to talk with the previous administration, and are you expecting to do the same with the Trump administration about Poland being in the nuclear sharing arrangements? And what were the US reactions to that, if you were able to talk about it with the Biden administration, but also within NATO, at the North Atlantic Council? How do you feel this debate going in NATO? And maybe a broader comment about this European dimension of the French vital interest, but also the global debate about Europe and the defense of Europe right now. I think it might be more threatened by domestic policies than by the US. Honestly, when we see how the speeches from President Macron in Sweden last year were completely twisted by some far-right and far-left MPs in France that are supposed to work collectively for France and also for Europe, I think it's quite worrying. And so I think if we want to act on nuclear deterrence and really the progresses of nuclear deterrence in Europe, we have to act now. And especially in France, we don't know who will be in power in May 27. And same in Germany, for example, it could have been another party that could have been like in leading the debate about it. And so, I think there is really an urgency, especially, of course, about the US might leaving Europe, but also because of the current policies, domestic policies in Europe. Thanks.
Merci, Héloïse. Monsieur?
Thank you, Héloïse. And sir, yes, thank you for this lecture. I would like to respond to what my colleague just said about nuclear deterrence vis-a-vis Russia. With all this political turmoil in Europe and the threat of the US to leave NATO, is it not the case that Putin, who's been playing with that strategy, I mean, he started off with Crimea, he acted quickly, there was no response, likewise with the Ukraine. Putin might think, well, they could try a conventional or nuclear attacking with no reprisals, no retaliation, because the credibility of deterrence is not so high. And maybe the problem for Europe or the West in general is that we simply cannot counter the strategy of the fait accompli when a country like Russia takes very dangerous initiatives and goes away unpunished. Thank you. Nicole Lisoto? Yes, thank you, sir. Nicole is right in front of you. Yes, this was an exciting lecture, sometimes disturbing, but just one point, because it would take us hours to get through that. You seem to think that NATO is a nuclear institution very much alive, but there's no nuclear institution. What we do have is America. America is the only country that decides, but the rest of it, the NPG, whether to involve Poland or not, that's just talk to make people happy, but that does not implement deterrence. You seem to think that Donald Trump is still reliable as a nuclear partner, as a nuclear actor in NATO. I don't think so, but assuming you're right, for the sake of the argument, you're saying that we should consolidate America's role in Europe, and so therefore we should increase our own conventional capabilities, our anti-missile defense, our deep strike missiles. So we need to build up a huge conventional capacity to have some hope of keeping American nuclear deterrence in Europe. So the scenario we are offering here is right. The Europeans, on their hand, will wage a huge conventional war should Russia attack. America waits and see whether its interest is at stake. So basically, you're decoupling. I mean, it's the Europeans do the conventional, the Americans the nuclear, and a huge conventional war in Europe seems to me is worse than a small limited nuclear war. So what's the point for the Europeans? What's the point for the Europeans to wage a huge conventional war in Europe? Because that would destroy Europe just as readily would a tactical nuclear strike from Russia. By the way, you said that Putin was prepared to use tactical nuclear weapons. At least he made statements to that effect about tactical weapons when he felt the most vulnerable or the weakest. And you said we should not repeat that situation. In other words, we should not have a situation where Russia is weak when it attacks us. Is that what you say? All right. The question, I mean, conventional war is the failure of deterrence. If we have a conventional war in Europe, it's because deterrence didn't work. And then in response to what Héloïse just said, in the connection, and of course, Artur will respond, that nuclear is also appropriate in domestic discussions. There's an issue of consensus in France. Do we have a consensus? It is because we had a consensus that there was no domestic debate about nuclear deterrence. So there was a unanimity there. So we have to maintain that consensus. Artur?
Thank you for all these comments and questions. I will take them as they go, but maybe not in some kind of very structured way because there's so much to address here. So actually, what I was trying to say as regards conventional forces is not that we should avoid Russians being desperate. We should avoid allowing them to make fait accompli, which in terms of defense of the eastern flank of the alliance means that we should do all in our power. Certainly my country will do that as regards our own territory, not to let Russians in. Because if you let them in, you start a number of problems, not just with them, slaughtering people like in Bucha, but also when it comes to nuclear deterrence. Because when they face a defeat, they might be more willing to use nuclear weapons. Doesn't mean that they will. The West can also signal, can also make its threats credible. That's what this whole nuclear deterrence discussion here is about. But I would start with not letting the Russians an inch on NATO territory, if we can do that, right? And I think it might have somehow, maybe I somehow didn't make this clear, but just contrary to the impression that you've got, I said that we should improve conventional forces in Europe for our security. Full stop. That's the main thing. So that we deter conventional war, which could turn nuclear. That being said, if the side effect of that is improving relations with the United States, that's even better. And as it comes to America's reliability, I think I can repeat that. There are big questions about America's reliability because of the reset they are trying to pursue with the Russians, because of how they want to withdraw forces from Europe, right? Some forces. And I would agree, even withdrawing some conventional forces weakens also the credibility of nuclear deterrence. But pragmatically, as long as they are here, especially as long as there are American troops deployed in Poland, I think that's important. I think that poses the risk to the Russians, even if, policy of US administration is not what you would like to be or what I would like to be, but still, as long as they are present in some form, I think it's important for deterrence. And we shouldn't just, try to totally supplement that. We should try to add that with our own capabilities. Now, okay, so many questions. Which one to pick? Okay, maybe an easy one. Maybe let's start with Polish discussion on nuclear weapons. Now, it's not, from what I've seen, it's not a political discussion right now, at least not yet, meaning that I don't see politicians discussing in public whether Poland should have nuclear weapons. Definitely, there's a growing interest, in the press, among commentators. We have some also very well-known commentators actually arguing for Poland to have nuclear weapons already. So maybe depending on what happens with Ukraine, Russia, US, we might have also a political discussion about it. It depends. Certainly many people are thinking about this. I've seen a recent poll from last week where more than 50% of Poles said that we should have nuclear weapons. Almost 50% says we should be nuclear sharing with the United States, but more support having our own national nuclear capability. And, that's not surprising. Other things. So, Alois, you asked about how Biden administration responded to nuclear sharing. Well, obviously they said that they are not going to, I think they said it in public, they are not going to deploy nuclear weapons in new places. I assume because they thought it would be provocative towards Russia, divisive in the alliance. But at the end of their term, if you listen to some of the Pentagon officials working on nuclear deterrence, they didn't exclude this option they did exclude option of deploying additional nuclear weapons somewhere, but they didn't exclude the option of certifying aircraft from additional countries. Because again, it would also have some military, political added value, but would be less controversial than moving the weapons themselves. So, and this was also floated by some Polish experts, Polish officials as well as a possible option. So if there was to be an extension of nuclear sharing, probably this would be that. So the bombs could stay where they are. You could have, for example, a fleet of Polish F-35s, which will be a kind of reserve force, right? Let's say German aircraft are destroyed at the earlier stages of war. Polish F-35s can take over their nuclear role. With Trump administration, I mean, as I said, I don't see Trump administration really being keen on doing this right now, but let's just keep in mind that we don't know exactly yet who is in the administration at lower levels, but definitely in the Republican circles, there are many nuclear hawks, including hawks who would support extending nuclear sharing. So I could just imagine that right now, the idea is to accommodate the Russians somehow. But if this fails, and it's not the first US president who tries to reset relations with Russia, you could argue that he is trying much more than some others, but it's not the first time the Americans are trying to reset relations with Russia, even in recent times, and it didn't work many ways. So if it doesn't work, there is a tiny chance that I think the Americans could be more hawkish again on the nuclear front. Again, another question from Alois was about proliferation. Yeah, I think nuclear proliferation, it depends on many factors. I would agree that nuclear proliferation among NATO countries is not the most likely scenario in the coming decade. So first of all, Ukraine, it would be very risky for Ukraine to try get nuclear weapons, and not easy, again. It's not like they can produce a credible nuclear arsenal right away, but they do have some spent nuclear fuel that could be reprocessed. They are working on long-range missiles, so there is they might get some kind of capability. Obviously, they would face a risk of Russian preemptive strike, although that risk wouldn't count if they are at war with Russia anyway. And they would probably face a risk, depending how the West behaves, of Western countries limiting their assistance as a kind of reprisal for trying to pursue nuclear weapons. That being said, and I don't know, I don't speak for Ukraine, but I would think, if I were in their shoes, if they don't get enough Western support anyway, then what's the problem? What options do you have left than to have some kind of, risky and, imperfect nuclear program if you are threatened by Russia and you don't get enough support from others? I mean, this might happen. Proliferation in Asia, it's not an imminent threat, but let's just remember what was happening in US-South Korean relations during the previous Trump administration. So South Koreans are not just worried about North Koreans developing nuclear weapons, which can both hit South Korea and increasingly the United States. So actually, I think that our South Korean colleagues are reliving the NATO's 1950s, 1960s moment when they realized that their protector, well, it could be hurt if he protects us. But then again, there were various tensions in the South Korea-US alliance at the time. Trump wanted South Korea to pay for presence of US forces on the peninsula, and he did talk to Kim Jong-un without the South Korean involvement. So I wouldn't be entirely surprised if something started to happen here, if the US-South Korean alliance was again under strain, even with the capabilities that South Koreans have and the fact that they did have a secret nuclear weapons program in the past. It's not like they can produce something quickly, a big arsenal. But let's say that with their level of support among the public for nuclear weapons, and some of the things like they have, like very impressive, so far conventional but missile capabilities, and some experiences in researching, for example, uranium enrichment, it's not unthinkable that they would try in 10 years. Japan, I would say probably less, because there's a strong anti-nuclear sentiment in Japan. From what all I know, they didn't have the kind of nuclear weapons program that the South Koreans had. But on the other hand, they do have large stocks of plutonium, which they could use if something happened to turn them into nuclear weapons. And they are worried about North Korea. They are worried about the Chinese expansion. And the very last thing about China and Northwest use, I think there are reasons to start thinking whether this would be really the case, because obviously the Chinese are investing first and foremost in those long-range nuclear weapons which could strike back at the United States. But they are also deploying more and more of these short and medium-range nuclear missiles, which makes you think, what do they need them for? Maybe for first use? I don't know. I'm not saying that that this is the obvious conclusion, but I wouldn't be surprised if they change their thinking closer to the Russian one at some point. I will stop here.
Je vais vous passer la parole.
I'll give you the floor. So regarding proliferation, I think if we were to look at all the nuclear forces in Europe, the British, the French, and the NATO forces, nuclear forces, we're looking at what? 700 warheads, nuclear warheads, compared to the 500 were declared from China, 3,500 to 4,000 potentially deployed by the Russians and 3,000 by the Americans. So regarding the number of warheads and the reorganizing, should there be a European deterrence, it's not so much the matter of the number as to how they're distributed, which you pointed out, the modernization, the new type of missile. I'll leave it at that. The very fine last question is for you, sir. Yes, well, thank you for this great lecture, and it's a very unusual discussion. My name is Jean-Pierre from Strategic Think Tank. About China, you said that in December 2022, under pressure from India, but also China, the Russians were deterred from using nuclear weapons. But in fact, what is the actual Chinese influence, and how long can that last on Russia?
Yeah, so just to clarify, I wouldn't say that I'm sure that Chinese, they did make some statements in the public. I would see some reasons why they might not want Russia to use a nuclear weapon in such a conflict, because of the all economic turmoil it might cause. Also because it might cause some other countries to develop nuclear weapons in such a case, especially Taiwan, maybe from Chinese perspective. So I just put it out there to say that Russians have seemed to be deterred in late 2022 from using nuclear weapons. There are various forces at play. If I were to make my judgment, I would probably say that the mixture of them being able to stabilize the line and Americans and some allies allegedly threatening conventional strikes was the decisive issue, precisely because, after all, even if Russians use a nuclear weapon, they would have plenty of common interest with the Chinese as regards countering the United States and reshaping the world order. So I think China would have a leverage on Russia's economic one, because Russia is becoming increasingly dependent on China when it comes to selling oil and some other things. So they would have the leverage, but I wouldn't definitely trust my security on whether China would be willing to use that leverage. I would trust this much more on deterrence, one way or the other. I know that you didn't suggest that. That's just what I'm saying. And one last thing, when we talk about European deterrence, I mean, to clarify, when I talked about joint development of nuclear weapons theoretically being the most efficient way for non-nuclear countries to get nuclear weapons. Again, this could be something similar to the FIG treaty. So countries working together, but acquiring their own national sovereign capabilities. I think it's a pipe dream to think about, and I don't think you said that, I'm just saying it for the record, to think about some ideas of, a joint nuclear deterrence in which, for example, 27 EU countries jointly make the decision to use nuclear weapons. It's not, first of all, it's not going to happen politically. Second of all, it would be entirely impractical. You might recall that in the 60s, the Americans had the idea of so-called multilateral nuclear force, which was supposed to reassure the Germans that they might have some bigger involvement of using nuclear weapons. Ships with crews from various NATO countries and nuclear missiles. Well, one of the problems in that was that the more fingers on the nuclear trigger you have, the more likely that one of the countries will actually not allow you to pull that trigger. So no joint EU, maybe joint EU nuclear weapons production, hypothetically, no joint EU nuclear weapons, kind of joint deterrence, ruled and controlled by almost 30 countries.
Et on est d'accord, la réflexion, elle était plus...
Yes, well, yeah, this was more quantitative thinking. I would like to thank Artur Kacprzyk for this remarkable lecture, very comprehensive, and I believe all of you were able to see that he wasn't running away from questions. He went to the end of his arguments, and that is something we can very much appreciate. I thought that was great. I myself was delighted, and since this was your first time here, I'm pretty sure that he'll come back, because he'll be very much expected back. Thank you, Artur.